I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as we have been doing throughout this conference, but I will just frame the discussion by quickly saying that Eric Feinberg, who's from the Coalition for a Safer Web, Dia Kayali from Mnemonic, and Courtney Retsch from UCLA, all have kind of reputations for asking very difficult questions and holding tech companies to account, as well as being constructive and providing input on the solutions that are being developed. So hopefully I think we can have that strong conversation today and ask some of those difficult questions, but also think about what some of those solutions might be and how we can move forward as a group. Eric, perhaps I can start with you and ask you to introduce yourself, but also respond to a kind of initial question. On your website, it says that you ask the question, why aren't major social media companies doing more to prevent their sites from being hijacked by extremists? I wondered if you could explain what you think those challenges are and what some of the solutions that you propose that tech companies could be adopting are.
Sure. Again, thanks for having me today. Yeah, one of the things we see, and what's the definition of extremists and terrorism? And that's one of the things we ask the questions for. And how nimble are the tech companies to adapt to new, we call new extremist groups or terrorist groups? One of the groups or ideologies we spent a lot of time now following is QAnon, and just the rise of QAnon across many social media platforms, and how QAnon migrates from the secondary social media sites to the primary social media sites. And that's what I think, what we're about at, the Coalition for a Safer Web, when we ask the questions, what is defined as a terrorist or extremist group, and how nimble, how fast can the tech companies and groups like, GIFCT act when something like this ideology, which, is being now, kind of condoned by, ex-President Trump and what we've seen. And that's what I think we're getting at here.
That's really helpful framing, Eric. I wonder if you can just go a little bit further in describing what you feel the solutions to that particular problem of where the fringes of those violent extremist groups blur into the more complex environments in the information space, and how tech companies can be more agile. How can they be addressing those challenges?
Well, we've proposed it. If you look, my president of the Coalition for a Safer Web, Mark Ginsburg, wrote a substantial, paper or terms of service called the Social Media Standards Board a few years ago. And we presented it in front of Congress. It's widely found on the web. And what we're talking about is creating a social media standards board, which, organizations like ourselves with, GIFCT work better and look at these things and kind of see how this stuff happens in real time. I think one of the things I've seen and what we do as a Coalition of a Safer Web is really understand the human engagement and how, and then, combining with, information distribution. And I don't think enough the time is spent on the human engagement. And again, I come back to QAnon and how QAnon takes advantage of real world events and then goes, to the secondary platforms such as Truth, Getter, Gab, and then how this gets transported and mitigated, migrates over to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And that's what I think not enough time is being spent on, is really understanding the human engagement, with the ability to use tech. And again, one of the things I've been talking about now is how product design or product development contributes to this.
No, I think that's a really fundamental point, that safety by design concept and how we build out design for tech companies is a really important part of what we're doing at GIFCT and talking about in things like the Tech Approaches Working Group that I lead. Dia, perhaps I can come to you next. Eric touched on the interplay between different platforms and folks moving between platforms. Clearly, to understand that picture, there's a lot of kind of investigative work that goes on in the background. And I know that you wrote recently for one of GiveCT's working groups a paper on data access, privacy, data protection, all of those kind of issues. I wonder if you can explain a little bit about why those issues are so core in this space and what the best practices are or the recommendations that you would have for how we can manage some of those issues around privacy and protection of data as we need to be doing this kind of investigative work.
Sure. Really great to be here this morning. My name is Dia. I'm Associate Director of Advocacy at Mnemonic. We're the parent organization for a set of human rights archives, the Syrian archive, Yemeni archive, Sudanese archive, and now Ukrainian archive. The list just it's getting too long to say. And that's because there is, unfortunately, this huge need for the discovery and use of human rights documentation from social media platforms. So I sort of came into this discussion because as we saw the use of technology to address terrorist content, the increased use of technology, we also started seeing human rights documentation getting deleted, and it was things that we had already archived, so we were actually able to compare. That background is important because the work that I did for the Legal Frameworks Working Group this year was really focused on the issue of what sort of data is needed in as we're removing more and more of this content. And I looked at two factors in particular. One is the issue, as I mentioned, of human rights documentation. So just seeing big chunks get deleted, what can we do about that? And this has become a real public discussion around Ukraine, actually, because there's a lot more acknowledgement of how important this content is. But the other, and I'm sure I'll get into that later, more in the discussion. But the other piece, which is a little bit more relevant to what Eric and Tom just asked me about, is the issue of what is it that governments actually need to understand how content is moving and what has happened with content. So for example, one of the interesting things that I heard as I was doing interviews for this paper, I talked to the chief censor of New Zealand. He's no longer in that position. And I was just asking him, what was your experience with tech companies after the Christchurch shooting? We know that live stream was not taken down very quickly. We have seen an improvement. But were you able to get the information you needed to understand what actually happened with the content? And his answer was no. And there was some sort of basic types of information, for example, exactly how many times the video was viewed and where it was viewed from, that we were not able to get. So that's the kind of information that potentially can be provided in a way that isn't just violating everyone's privacy. We don't want, a big theme of my work was, yes, there is a need to address this over removal of some types of content. There's also a need to understand better how the content is moving. And so we need information to do that, but we need to think about personally identifiable information and not just creating a vast trove of data. We can't just throw big data at this problem to solve it. And just the last thing I'll say, after the Buffalo incident, I was a member of the Legal Frameworks Working Group, but also of the Crisis Response Working Group. And so through my membership in that group and also as a member of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, I got debriefs on the Buffalo shooting and the protocol that was activated after that. And I have to say, it's clear that in the time since Christchurch, there is a lot more information about how this content is traveling amongst platforms. And there's a much bigger focus on what do we do about the small platforms that are never going to sign up to something like the Christchurch Call. They're never going to become a member of GiveCT. And as somebody from, I think it was Google, I'm not sure. So, somebody from a big tech company said yesterday, it's a little bit of a contagion, that if you can't get the content off of the small platforms, then it's just going to keep popping up elsewhere through URL sharing, through copying and pasting, all of the techniques that we've seen. So I think there's still a big need to understand how we can share more information, while not just, revealing the identities of everybody that potentially ever came into contact with a piece of content, like it popped up on their timeline. That's not what we're trying to do. And I think that there is, just the last thing I'll say, because there was an interesting announcement yesterday at this Christchurch Call Leaders Summit, that there will actually be a new initiative between the US government, the New Zealand government, and Twitter, looking at how to share more privacy protecting sets of data to understand how recommender algorithms are working. So we are really getting somewhere. I think that's important to say. It's been a few years since the Christchurch massacre. We are seeing a lot more willingness from tech companies to share information, and we're not losing that concern about privacy, which is really great to see. So I'm really excited to see where this new effort around sharing information around recommender algorithms is going to go. They're going to have a lot of work to share that in a privacy protecting way, but it sounds like they're committed to it.
No, I think that's a really interesting point, Dia. And when it comes to recommender algorithms, honestly, it's one of the terms that I hear most kind of abused around the
I thought
community.
it when I said it.
Largely because it can mean so many different things. So many different things are recommended to us online these days, whether it's content or who you should be friends with, what groups you should be part of, products that are placed alongside, and all of those have very different aspects to them, and obviously very different sets of data behind them, and the privacy concerns of that data can be really significant because it's very personalized recommendations that are being made, and lots of very sensitive factors that can go into that. And at the same time as we're looking at recommender algorithms, we're also looking at a number of different interventions that can be taken place, whether it's removal from platforms or kind of labeling of information on platforms, of posts on platforms with warnings, or deranking or raising positive alternative narratives. Increasingly, that we really need to understand those interventions and how they're operating on tech platforms. And Courtney, I wonder if I can come to you to kind of round out this initial round of questions and ask about another recent paper that you wrote for GIFCT for our working group on transparency. But how are tech companies beginning to share that information about the interventions that they've put in place, and what are the recommendations that you have for how that can improve over time?
Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, there's definitely been a long evolution of this process, and similar to Dia, I'm also been involved in the Christchurch Call since it was started, and the GIFCT since it was just a kind of initiative without a name. The transparency issue is really important for legitimacy, and so that's why I think we focus so much on the idea of transparency. And what does that mean? Dia mentioned recommender systems, but more broadly, if we take a step back, transparency is a way that we can establish legitimacy. And I think when we're talking about internet platforms getting together to control what we see online for good or for bad, that's something that we want to have really good oversight on and make sure that the way that they're kind of moderating this vast amount of content online, which is ultimately, people's expression and ability to freely associate, is not resulting in the removal of important human rights documentation, as Dia mentioned. I've worked in this space primarily looking at how we protect journalistic content, because when we talk about taking down terrorism, it's hard to figure out if something is covering terrorism, promoting terrorism, recruiting for terrorism, et cetera. So when it comes to transparency, there are a few different vectors where we want to make sure that there is greater transparency. One is into how this type of, I'm using content moderation, broadly in the broadest sense in terms of, how content is actioned by platforms, whether that's removal or de-amplification, et cetera. So being able to understand what's happening to content and why is really fundamental. And so one of the challenges, I think, with our approach to fighting terrorism and extremism online is that currently happens in a big black box inside of a company, and without, I think, sufficient explanation. So if we look at other sectors like the finance sector or mining, and this is what I did in my paper, is to examine how do other sectors, including ones that handle very sensitive information, that have to think about privacy, that need to think about legitimacy, deal with reporting on their activities or their impacts, and what we can learn for the GIFT-CT and its member companies. So, a few overarching things that we learned is we really need to understand what the objective is. And I think we still have not clearly defined that when it comes to terrorism. On the one hand, we've heard Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand say that she wants to eradicate terrorism online. That's, a pretty big ask. Some people may hear that and think, great. Other people may hear that and think, wow, that's really tough because what is considered terrorism keeps evolving. How do we make sure that there's some oversight into how different groups of people are impacted so that they don't overly impact one religion or one nationality or whatever, one identity group over another? So making sure that the rules are clearly laid out, the processes, that we have insight into the governance process and what the objective is. Others might say the objective is to get it off of the major platforms. And I think it'd be interesting to hear from Eric, what the trade-offs on error rates and it's not just about error rates because they stand in a vacuum, but because they have real impact on people's lives. The reason I got interested in this in the first place is because I got to know the citizen journalists from Raqqa as being slaughtered silently, which was a citizen journalism group in Syria who lost 5 members of their team because they were murdered by ISIS. And they were literally risking their lives to bring information from the so-called, capital of the caliphate. So when their content was taken down as terrorism, that meant that the world could not see what was happening in the premier foreign policy issue of the day, the Syrian war. So there's this tension between wanting to combat terrorism, how we do that in a way that is transparent. How do we define, what are the definitions, what are the objectives, and what are the impacts? And right now, the biggest black box is on impacts. And I think just to conclude, when we come to the GIFT-CT, the challenge of figuring out how to provide transparency into the actions of the hash database is one of the biggest, I think, challenges for us to figure out, because this is a method that seems to be working well. Is it perfect? Does it get terrorism off the internet right away? No. But we know with recent shootings that it took only minutes for a crisis incident protocol to be declared and for platforms to take stuff off of their platforms. And I think just to Eric's point about needing to be faster, faster comes with greater challenges and greater needs for transparency, because faster means that you're going to have to use pre-upload filters. You have really good classification of data. And I think that's kind of where this tension comes in. And one of the things we need to do as a community is to figure out what is the objective here and what are the trade-offs as we pursue that? And how do we use transparency to mitigate some of the negative impacts of this type of work?
I think that's a really important point that you finished there with, Courtney, just thinking about how transparency and impact are really linked and fundamentally so. Eric, perhaps I can come to you with the first question that Courtney asked around how we balance that trade-off between pushing violent extremists and terrorists off those mainstream platforms and pushing them onto smaller, less regulated platforms where, hey, they may not have the same reach that they have, but they have a kind of supportive community. So that's the first question I would ask you. And the second question, I really want to acknowledge the diversity in the tech companies, both that GIFCT represent and the wider ecosystem. There are some massive companies that are part of GIFCT, like Facebook, like YouTube, like Amazon, huge companies with massive user bases and diverse platforms that they're working on. We equally have tiny companies like Just Paste It, which is a one-person company, very small organization, still a relatively large user base, but obviously very different resource picture. And we have companies who are very highly impacted by the content in particular that terrorists are trying to push online. But we also have companies who are impacted in different ways. Folks like Zoom and Airbnb, who are more concerned with the networks of people that are using their services to promote their terrorist activities. Given that diversity of tech companies, the diversity of platforms out there, and the fact that there's this distinction between tech companies who are coming to the table and trying to proactively work in this space, and tech companies who genuinely won't, how do you think that we should be supporting those tech companies and the broader community that's trying to do this work to find solutions that can really help those companies who have a very different resource picture than the ones that we perhaps all jump to our minds first, like the Facebooks and the YouTubes of this world? How do we support those much smaller companies with much different resource pictures and actually more complex problems?
That for me?
Yes, that's where I was aiming it, but feel free to pivot.
Tom, I keep coming back and I'm listening to this product design. Is TikTok part of GIFT?
They are not today, no.
Well, there's something that should be part of GIFT, because I've been doing a lot of studying on TikTok and how extremist groups are using TikTok and then uploading them to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. And the TikTok phenomenon has kind of created other platforms such as Facebook, Instagram with their real version, okay? And this is where I come back to product design. Because in product design, in 30, 40-second video clips, you can actually do a really good job in embedding or putting in the middle of a video a call to action. And coming back to Courtney said, you got to really look twice to decide, is that an extremist video post or is that a news service post reporting on extremism? And I think one of the biggest things I'm pushing for now after studying, TikTok and Reels and Top Stories and Snapchat over the last year is product design needs to be a very important part of how we go forward here. Because I'm looking at these short clip videos and seeing how they can be used to radicalize and recruit. I've done some tremendous study over the last year on Russian propaganda's use, Russian groups' propaganda on TikTok, and how those TikTok videos then make their way onto Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter.
Yeah, and I think that problem of cross-posting, Eric, is a really challenging one. Moving between platforms, as we've said, is a really difficult challenge and brings some complexity for content moderators. How much is that on the content moderators on the originating platform versus where it's cross-posted to? If it's just a URL as well, often tech companies won't have the context to understand what that URL is, and clicking on every individual URL and moving through to a potentially a terrorist-owned website or some place that is less secure may not be always possible. So that is a significant challenge for content moderators. How would you suggest tech companies begin to unpack that, or what resources can we provide to them to help?
Well, I think, again, us, social media standards boards, some of the things we said to really see and understand, and needs to be better reporting and better transparency on what's going on here. And you need to have, just like I'm here, more outside subject matter experts like myself who study these things and then could put out these reports and saying, okay, here's new techniques being used by these extremist groups. And it requires sometimes a human eye as opposed to an algorithm or AI. I'll give you one example that I picked up on now. A lot of the platforms have done a really good job in not allowing QAnon, where we go one, we go all with the A. But I'm finding now, and again, they know how to communicate or a certain code, that these QAnon groups are replacing the A with the ampersand. Mm-hmm. So again, you start seeing it and how then content gets distributed through hashtags or creates a queue, that QAnon followers or people who want to get QAnon content can then understand how to follow it. Because again, even though the platforms don't allow you, they say they take, where we go one, we go all with the A, you can still find this stuff because QAnon is smart enough to change the A to an ampersand to get that content out there.
I think that perfectly captures what I would call adversarial shift. The violent extremist groups out there are always innovating. They're always coming up with new creative ways to come around whatever situation we find ourselves in. And one of the pieces of work that I lead on at GiftCT is how we deal with our crisis response. And Dia, I know you've been part of the work that we've done on crisis response. And Courtney mentioned earlier that when we move fast, we have a particular responsibility to improve transparency, and that's really critical in a crisis situation. I wonder if you can talk through what you see as some of the particular challenges when we are moving quickly, when the situation is a crisis, and when there's that lack of clarity about what is actually happening, both on the ground and online, and how we manage the risks that throws up.
Yeah, so I actually want to take a little bit of a step back from that to speak to something that both Courtney and Eric said, and that's about, at the end of the day, what is our goal? Because I think it's really important. Eric, you said something interesting. You said, on the one hand, you think companies should be faster. On the other hand, sometimes you need a human eye to understand what it is that is actually being seen. And the human cost of moderating this kind of content is something that we shouldn't ignore. It's a really horrible job. It's a really traumatic job. People don't get paid enough for it, and I think we should always bring content moderators into these discussions and say, hey, they should be paid more. They should be employees of tech companies, not contracted out, so that the companies can say it's not our fault that they have bad conditions. So I just want to be a voice for content moderators in this room. But in terms of, and something I think that's helpful to say in terms of my perspective on these issues. So on the one hand, I'm concerned about all this content that is being improperly deleted. And that was a big part of the GiftCT paper. I talked about the removal of content that was directly serving as human rights documentation from Yemen, as there was a discussion about designating the Houthis as a terrorist organization coming from the US. And these US definitions and US ideas heavily influence all of this. And that's really important actually for your question, because when we're talking about crisis response, are we talking about crisis response because of Islamist attacks? How many SIPs have actually been activated in response to attacks that were carried out by organizations that are designated by the US as terrorist organizations? I mean, can you?
The answer is, I believe none. Maybe one.
Maybe one. There was the wasn't there a beheading SIP?
So there was an attack.
But maybe it wasn't a SIP.
It's not necessarily all. I think the key point here is it's not clear at the moment of a SIP what the attribution of the attacker is.
But also the key point is that you can't think of a single incident in which a designated US terror organization was the cause of the activation of a content incident protocol. And I just want to be clear for everybody who's maybe not familiar with that. Content incident protocol is when there is a live streamed terrorist attack, and GiftCT calls up this protocol and it helps all of that content get hashed very quickly. There's some discussion about what the response should be amongst the companies and points of contact. So it's a rapid response thing. It's a crisis response, and it's only with a live streamed content that is either by the attacker or one of their accomplices. So it's a very specific tool. But the point I'm making is that these are being used for far-right violence. But that's not part of the definition that we usually have. And in fact, I would even push more on that. I didn't see on the schedule, I unfortunately had to get here late, but I didn't see on the schedule for this event a lot of discussion about gender identity-based violence. And we're sitting here just shortly after the FBI finally filed charges against somebody for their hoax bomb threat against the Boston Children's Hospital. So is our objective that we should be taking down content that's related to bomb threats? Because I think that would maybe be a reasonable objective, but the Libs of TikTok account is still up on Twitter right now. Twitter, who's a GIFC team member, by the way. And I think that it's okay to have varying ideas of what you think should happen and what is a crisis, but all of that needs to be clear, and it's not clear right now. I think sometimes people to participate in something like the GIFC or the Christchurch call thinking, it's going to address that kind of violence. It's going to address threats against trans people and doxing and all of that. But that's not actually part of the definition. That's not part of what we're trying to address right now. So I think just to wrap it up, I'm sorry, because I know I've been talking for a long time. I also just wanted to make sure folks knew what we were talking about with the content incident protocol. One of the pieces of transparency we need is how we're managing all these different definitions, how the GIFC team members are managing, and in fact, from what I understand, that is going to be a focus next year for the working groups, right? Is again this issue of sort of definitions.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is great. I think that's really important. And then the last piece I'll say is just I think it was really great to bring civil society into the debrief for the Buffalo incident.
Yep.
I would just suggest that civil society is brought in earlier in that crisis management phase, right? Where there's some discussion, there's a little bit of increased communication between different stakeholders, corporations and governments. Civil society should be a part of that as well. So I think that's one place where we could really use increased transparency.
Yeah, I think.
Night.
Sorry, I was going to come to Courtney next, but just before I do, I just wanted to make sure that everybody has clarity around what the content incident protocol is and what it's there to do. Really, it's there to deal with a really niche, specific kind of threat, but it explicitly doesn't define what terrorism and violent extremism is. And the reason is that at the point of an attack, we really don't know who the attacker is or what the motivation is. So we explicitly say that it has to be a situation where there's a live stream produced by the perpetrator or their accomplices. There has to be depicting murder or attempted murder. It has to be on a member platform or so widely available online that it's inevitable that that content will be on a member's platform. And then that it is a terrorist or mass violence incident. And that mass violence incident is very, very broad, right? For example, we saw the attack in Memphis, Tennessee earlier this month. But that met the criteria for a SIP, and we published a blog to explain why that was activated, and we should have more details coming out about that soon. Certainly wasn't what we would think of as a violent extremist attack. The motivations of that attacker were very unclear and still are unclear, but not what we would traditionally think of as a hate-based violence in the same way. But the reason the SIP was activated in that case is because it's a mass violence attack with that perpetrator-produced live stream, with the depiction of murder. And at the point of crisis, we can't be sure what the motivation is. And so we need to make sure that we're transparent about what we've done, why we've done it, and then have recourse when the situation becomes clearer later. And we're working closely on that. Courtney, I wanted to come to you to talk about one of what I think was one of your kind of core interests here, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit. As we're going through these processes, and GIFT are working on things, Tech Against Terrorism are working on things, and tech companies themselves are working on different interventions. There is you mentioned oversight and accountability. I wonder if you can explain what you mean by those things and how you think a more robust oversight and accountability system could operate.
Sure. Thanks for that question. So I think there are a couple of different levels. One is transparency and oversight into the hash database as a particular product, as well as kind of other types of products of the GIFCT. So like the content incident protocol, et cetera, which, I mean, there is definitely reporting by GIFCT, but it can be more. Also, at the level of the organization itself. How is it governed? What is the legitimacy of this organization that is literally controlling a vast number, or a vast swath of the internet and the public sphere for the world? How is that governed? How is that legitimate? And there is a governance structure for the GIFCT that includes civil society and government. I serve on the International Advisory Committee, but that is a non-binding advisory, volunteer role versus, say, a board of directors that has oversight. And the reason I mention that is because multi-stakeholderism, I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with it, but it's this idea that you need to have different types of stakeholders representing different types of interests, particularly sectoral interests. So private companies, the tech platforms, governments, civil society, those are usually kind of the three big buckets. And that's designed because these are essentially self-regulatory, self-governing efforts. And so we really need to understand, how are these decisions made? Right now the GIFCT is, the hash database, for example, only deals with UN designated terrorist organizations. And when the war in Ukraine broke out, I would have assumed that, they would have potentially heard about a content incident protocol or thought about, activating one, for better or worse. My asking a question does not imply that that's what I want to happen. But we can see now that there is this kind of proof of concept with the approach that the GIFCT is taking. There's more that needs to be done, but definitely we're seeing the expansion of its work to potentially address terrorism and extremism drivers, like, as Dia mentioned, hate against particular identity groups, dehumanization, disinformation. So we're seeing the expansion of this mandate already. The mandate expanded from terrorism to extremism. So, this is continuing along that line. The key is that we need to have transparency and legitimacy if that's going to happen. And to Eric's, just kind of respond what Eric said, it will depend that for the most part on algorithms to enforce because of the level of content. And so then we have to think about, again, what is the objective? Is it primarily the violent promotion? So the live streams, like Dia said, that seems to be, going pretty well. But on the hash database, because it's so limited, and then we have no view into what type of content is being affected. How do we train the machine learning classifiers to make sure that they're doing a good job of identifying that? Because we have to rely on algorithms. There is no other way to do this at the scale of the internet. And you can have a human review, but right now that only happens in the company level, and there's kind of this disconnect between how that links into this broader effort to take down terrorism and violent extremism. But to the point I think that Dia was making as well is, there is currently this disconnect for why the GIFCT was set up, which was a pretty narrow, Al-Qaeda and ISIS really using the internet, especially ISIS. And then now that we're seeing a lot of the violence, I mean, we're here, I'm sad not to be there with you in Pittsburgh, but, we're talking about the rise in anti-Semitism around the world, about attacks on synagogues. That would not have been included, in the GIFCT. It might have been, and probably would be, a content incident protocol, but it wouldn't really, it's not just about the live streaming. So again, I think that we really have to figure out what the goal is and how that relates to our fundamental human rights. It is terrible for recruitment to happen online, but recruitment happens on the telephone, it happens on posters, and it happens in person at meetings. That is fundamentally a freedom of association issue, unless it is a designated, organization under whatever national legal framework you're looking at, which has its own, challenges. But I think we have to be really careful if we're trying to eradicate the right to freedom of expression or association online. How do we maintain those rights without also, turning the internet into the vast cesspool of hate and misogyny and extremism that it seems to be becoming? And we're going to have those difficult conversations about, error rates, about what sort of trade-offs we're willing to have. And transparency is really the only way that we're going to address that. And we need legislators, particularly in Europe, to figure out how can you have the GDPR, which is Europe's privacy law. It's the reason you see all those windows popping up asking you if you want to accept the cookies or not, to put it in, just kind of mildly. But this major privacy law, which is very important. On the other hand, it's also being used as an excuse not to figure out how to make the content and the affected groups and the impact on our freedom of expression and association rights more transparent. So we need to figure out how to reconcile, as Dia put it very well, privacy rights with these other rights so that we can more effectively address this algorithmically, but also provide an opportunity for human oversight.
I think you raised some really important points there, Courtney. And one of the things that I spend, honestly, most of my time thinking about is how we build out the technology that GIFCT is supporting, the tools like the hash sharing database, like our communications platforms around the content incident protocol and our incident response framework, while we think about how we're respecting fundamental and universal human rights. As you know, we had a human rights impact assessment last year. Some of those recommendations from that report we've implemented. Some we are implementing, and some are honestly going to take a long time to get to. But I would encourage you all to go to our website and read that report, because it's really what drives my day-to-day work, is how we can take the recommendations from that report and the continued engagement we have with civil society groups and really start to implement that while we're still trying to advance the mission of GIFCT and drive that forward, because both of those things need to happen in parallel. We can't go massively fast with more interventions in the counterterrorism space without also building out the human rights infrastructure and that optimization of different rights that are sometimes competing. We need to build those two things together and really think about a conscious design so that those things are working to support each other rather than working against each other. The other point that Courtney raised that I'd like to just highlight before I move to questions from the audience is really around legislation, and where legislation is at times in conflict with each other. We have different jurisdictions having legislation that at times conflict. We have occasions where one law in one jurisdiction is mandating that a piece of content must stay up, and another law in another country is mandating that same piece of content must come down. It forces companies into a position where they have to choose which jurisdiction they're operating and which law they're going to break, which is not a situation any of us want to be in. And that coherence is really becoming a problem, and I think one area that we need to address in future. With that, I would like to just look around the audience and see if there are any questions that folks have. Yes, I see one at the back. I'll repeat it for the folks on Zoom one.
Hi. My question is this. So as greater measures are being taken on these technology spaces and on these platforms, extremists that are using them are becoming more sophisticated in order to evade. It's just natural. So the question is, as your organization continue to implement policies and work with these tech companies, what is being done on the back end for the individuals who we see becoming more technologically sophisticated? Is anything being done to kind of think about those?
Yeah, so just to kind of quickly restate that question, as we all put in interventions, and I'll kind of broaden this slightly to go beyond what GIFCT are doing, but also to think about the kind of full range of law enforcement actions and even some of the prevent work that we see at earlier stages. The adversary is always shifting and developing their methodologies and their ways of operating. So what is being done, or what could be done, to help ameliorate that problem and to really look at the individuals who are in that space and becoming more technologically savvy and becoming more technologically advanced? How do we deal with that phenomenon? I wonder if, Eric, we should start with you on that and then jump to any other, Dia and Courtney, if you have input. Yeah.
Well, I'm listening and trying to figure this out and hear what everybody said. And, again, I keep coming back to product design and certain things that, I use a term in what we're doing here called anticipatory intelligence. And there's a lot of tells that these nefarious groups use that I don't know if it's being, captured or put in a database, but a lot of what I do in, the content moderation is you start to study these groups enough and you can start seeing their tells and, how they communicate and what should be done. There should be a way to, instead of having the analysts look and review the AI, you need to teach the AI on how to anticipate what the tells are and maybe reduce or block that content from going on. And again, I keep coming back to product design. And I don't think enough money is being spent to really understand how product design is being manipulated and how to solve this on the front end by anticipating the communications or how these nefarious groups use this. And I think one of the big things I'm listening here and not enough attention is being paid to, and I think Courtney touched on some of this with the anti-Semitism, a big part of what GIFT or anybody's doing has to do with this worldwide phenomenon now of this right-wing extremism. Because I think that's the biggest danger to what we have here in the United States and what's going on around the world. And that's part of one of our biggest missions, or what we spend a lot of time on at the Coalition for Safer Web, is really studying the rise of right-wing extremism and how social media and encrypted apps allowed this become mainstream. Courtney said before, you could have these things in a room, put a poster up. But what happened is, and I saw this now, is someone said this because of social media, is the guy doesn't have to stand on a street corner anymore. He can just post one thing, to a couple of social media platforms. And before you know it, he's found 1,000 people of like minds who, again, QAnon, anti-Semitism, right-wing extremists, and that's the danger now.
Tom, can I respond to that?
Please,
because
yeah.
I mean, on one hand, yes, yes, you can post something out there and 1,000 people see it. But what we know from the research is that's not usually how it happens, right? It's not just like one post here. It's like a concerted effort. And I think we have to take a step back in response to this question is you can do all the moderation you want on social media. You can, restrict everything and take down everything when our political leaders are the extremists and the right-wing, extremists who are promoting QAnon ideas or whatever the issue du jour, or anti-Muslim sentiment in India, anti-Semitism in many countries around the world, anti-Islam in many, Western European and, Christian majority countries. Sorry, but this is not a social media problem. This is a societal problem. And I'm really concerned when the idea of anticipatory intervention, especially until there is much better transparency, is really scary, because the level of trust that we have in these companies and their separation from the government for good or bad is very tenuous. And, the ability to, again, associate or express oneself and to connect with people is a fundamental core value to citizens and to humans. It's human rights. I think that we need to look at a whole of society approach that addresses the mainstream media's role. Yesterday we talked on this session about kind of journalism and how to do journalism in a way that covers things without amplifying them. We're talking later with advertisers and about how advertisers can kind of intervene, to Eric's point, into the design of the platform, so they're not monetizing this type of content, which is important. So I think we need to be clear about what we can do through technology and platform-based interventions, and the reality that until we take a whole of society approach, it's not going to be sufficient. And I would be concerned that it would lead to graver human rights abuses, particularly in countries where minoritized groups are defined as terrorists. So yeah, I just think we need to be really careful with that.
I think that's a very well said point. Dear, I see that you want to come in as well.
Yeah, just very quickly to say that, as I mentioned yesterday, I was at this Christchurch Call Leaders Summit. It was a really interesting discussion. One of the things, Christchurch Call and GiftCT are obviously related. Some of the objectives of the Christchurch Call are sort of carried out in cooperation with GiftCT. But one of the big differences, and something I think is really worth pointing out, is that if you go to Christchurch Call, the website, it has the whole text on there. And two pieces that are in the text are in terms of the commitments for the people that sign on, the countries and the companies. Countering the drivers of terrorism and violent extremism, and trying to build up societal resilience. And I bring those up because Courtney's absolutely right. This is not, nothing that's happening online is divorced from reality. I mentioned trans people. We've seen the biggest wave of anti-trans legislation in the United States, the highest rates globally of trans people being murdered. Courtney also mentioned India. We've seen elected officials regularly spreading content that is pretty directly linked to violence. And so this is a whole of society problem, and the title of this discussion is Tech Against Terrorism, but I think that's actually very dangerous, right? Like, we don't, at the end of the day, it can't just be technology. And one of the problems is that we get particularly elected officials who want an easy solution. There is not an easy solution, and there has to be frankly, a lot more money going towards, and with countering the drivers and societal resilience, I just have to say, my background before ever coming into the sort of technology space was working with Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities in the San Francisco Bay Area, community organizing around the impacts of the use of the Joint Terrorism Task Force on those communities. And I'm Syrian American, I should say. That's how I found myself in this space. So, that's not countering the social drivers. I was at this last discussion about entrapment versus investigation. There's so many more things that we could be doing, and I think to a certain extent we could learn a little bit from, for example, the Canadian government's approach or the New Zealand government's approach, where they actually they pay psychologists as part of their work on this issue to be going out, reaching out to communities when there's a violent attack. They go and reach out not just to the communities that were the targets of the attack, but the communities that could be perceived as the instigators of the attack. And that's not something that certainly the U.S. is not doing that. And we really bear a responsibility to, and I'm not talking about countering violent extremism. I'm talking about countering the societal drivers. That has to be part of our focus. And yeah, sorry, I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we're having these discussions about technology. We get into trouble when we think technology is the answer. It's just part of the answer.
But to Eric's point, the design of the platforms also do matter, really, right? The idea that, say, take Facebook and, friends of friends leads to polarization, right? The design of the platforms that incentivize engagement ends up, favoring kind of extremist content, not necessarily just violent, but just content that gets you riled up, right? So there is absolutely a design element, but I think Dia and I just want to make sure that is recognized as a critical portion, but it is a tiny part of the broader issue.
I think that I see we have lots of other questions in the audience, but we're running out of time. So I'll say, Dia and I certainly will be here afterwards. If you want to come and pick my brain, feel free to do that. Thank you to all of our panelists. I will just wrap up by saying, I think the thing that I would take away from this panel is tech against terrorism. Yes, it's an important part of the solution. It's important that GiftCT is in the space that we are, trying to coordinate that technology sector effort. and it's important that our partners Tech Against Terrorism are working with some of the really small platforms to just try and up their baseline and give them the support they need. However, it needs not to stand alone. It needs to be part of a holistic solution, looking at all of those different aspects that Dia described that the Christchurch Call are looking at, and it needs to look at all the different sectors, the multi-stakeholder approach. We need to be bringing in different voices from civil society, different voices who are subject matter experts in counterterrorism, voices from government and voices from tech, all to be sitting down to try and discuss some of these really core problems. And we do have GIFCT working groups that we've mentioned kind of throughout this. We're just beginning a new cycle of those working groups. And if you'd like to be involved in some of these discussions over the next 12 months, please come in and reach out to me, and I can help you find the applications for those working groups, which just went live yesterday. So I'm happy to point you into the direction of those application forms if you're interested. With that, I'll just say thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience, and thank you to the conference organizers here for having us. I thought it was a really fantastic panel, so thank you to everybody.